together. And so I've always sort of pushed back on this idea of sort of national histories. And I've always thought, okay, of understanding American history as part of world history and appreciating sort of regional connections. So what I want to do today is talk a little bit about the importance of African Americans in world history. How does that sound? Does that sound okay? Should we do that? Okay, all right, let's do it. All right. So let me show you this. Does anybody know what this is by any chance? Do you recognize it? Well, as one of the things that I do, I'm a little bit of a weirdo. I go to my colleagues in different fields of study, and I ask them to look at stuff that I'm working on from their disciplinary perspective, because they often kind of have insights that I don't appreciate. And one art historian said, well, one thing that I do when I'm with students and I show an image is I ask them to describe it. So what do you see here? Just describe it. You can shout it out. Barnacles. Barnacles, yeah, it looks like barnacles, very much. Anything else? Looking down at the forest. Oh, that's interesting. So like an aerial view, yeah. Anything else? Can you tell what it's made of? Ivory, okay.
Clay.
What's that?
Clay.
Clay, okay, some clay. Yeah, on wood, okay, so there's wood there. It's about this big, by the way, right? What it is, and I'm going to go to the next slide, it's called a Lukasa memory board. This is from the Luba people. The Luba people are in the area of Central Africa, which is the area of the Democratic Republic of Congo. And what it is, it's made of wood and beads and metal and some other little pieces. It's from the 19th, early 20th century. And what it is, it's actually used by people who are going to tell stories about their community, their society, their kingdom, kind of like griots, right? The West African griots. But they use this not as a sort of a literal sort of translation, but more as a sort of a guide to kind of help you move along and remember certain connections and relationships. It's absolutely fascinating to me, the ways in which we've constructed tools for communication. So in some ways, this talk, this PowerPoint that I have here is kind of like my Lukasa board, okay? Because I don't have it scripted, it's sort of a guide to take us through the story here. So one of the things I think is really important, as I was telling the gentleman here, that we share ears together and language and other things, is just to kind of remember that we are the beneficiaries of all the people that came before us. And any degree of success that we've had is because of the people around us who've helped us. So I wanted to do this because it's a very African thing to do, which is to kind of do a shout out to your ancestors. And so these are actually my teachers. So the people in the middle, the two people, that's my mom and dad, they were dating, adorable, yes, okay. And then Professor Foner at the top there, he was my dissertation advisor on the left. Maxwell Owusu was my research guide when we did field work in West Africa, and my professor when I was at Michigan briefly. Fulani, who was a psychologist who's been a great mentor, Manning Marable, African-American historian, and Jackie Sale. So these are some of my teachers. I just wanted to say that's who helped make me. So you can thank them if you like what I have to say. But don't blame them for dumb things that I say, okay? So my scholarship, these are some of the books that I've written and journals. And what I've done is I started in African American history after having studied African history and done work there, and then moved into Latin America, and then moved over to the Indian Ocean world. And then now I have a book coming out with a classical philologist, a scholar of classics, Greco-Roman world, looking at the ancient Mediterranean world. And so I've been like all over the map. And the only way that I've been able to do that is really by partnering with others. So again, understanding we're more powerful, we're more effective if we're working collectively. So one of the things I want to do in exploring African Americans in world history is to, in some ways, reimagine or reconceptualize what we mean by certain categories of things, and this will, I'm sounding mysterious here, but it'll become apparent. So let me ask you, what do farmers, sailors, metal workers, and bakers have in common? What do you think they have in common? What do these people have in common? Farmers, sailors, metal workers, and bakers. They're creators, absolutely. They're creators. They do that for a living. They create things for a living. What else? They work with their hands. You look familiar. I know you.
From UNCG.
Oh, there we go. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. What is your name?
Susan.
Hi.
Yes, good to see you.
Nice to see you as well. Yeah, they work with their hands. How else?
I'm
Yeah.
not sure about the metal workers, but they up until they have something to do with bringing food to us.
Oh yeah, that's right. Those folks have something to do to bring food to us. Kind of basic, important thing.
Well, all of their activities would interact. Each of their
Oh yeah,
affect each other's.
that's right. They are often working they're in conversation, or they're part of the same production processes in terms of farmers baking things, sailors taking it, metal workers, maybe the cases that were being used, bakers, using what the farmers are producing. So yeah, that's interesting. Any other things? Any other thoughts? Let me take you through something, okay? Do they not all systematically observe, right? Ask questions, hypothesize, fancy word, experiment, replicate their results, and predict? Let's go back. Think about farmers. They're observing, right? You kind of have to be paying attention, right? They're asking questions. I wonder if I plant the seeds a little further apart, I wonder what will happen, which is a hypothesis, right? They experiment, right? They try it out one season after another. And if they do that successfully, they can predict things, right? Don't sailors do things like that too, right? And we can go on, right? Metal workers and bakers, right? How much yeast should I put in? Temperature, right? So I'd venture to say that these folks are scientists. Now that might rub some people the wrong way, especially if you're trained as a scientist. And even if you're not, in our society we make these huge divisions between the scientists over here, the artists over here, the literary people over here, like that. But that's not who we are. We're multiple things. And so science is a word. I don't know, does anybody know when the word scientist came about? You have a sense? How long ago? Take a guess. Was it like 10,000 years ago? Was it last week? All right, it wasn't last week. It was somewhere in between those two dates. It was actually in about 1834. It was in 1834 that a historian and philosopher of science from Cambridge, who decided, calling people cultivators of science or natural philosophers, which is the more common term, was just too wordy. And there was this term called artist out there in the world. So he came up with this idea of calling people who were doing what we call chemistry or physics or biology scientists, right? But I think that if we look at human activity, right, and I would distinguish it from just random play. That's why I say that people are doing these systematically. And there's a whole philosophy of science that talks about the way you have to. The science is something that's intentional. That haphazardly things happen. I mean, we would not have penicillin if it wasn't sort of for some serendipity, right? But there's systematicness or systematic activity in trying to replicate results. So if we agree, if we can agree for the moment, you might not fully agree, that these folks are scientists, that opens up the possibility for us to see many more forms of life and sharing in common and actually pushing the timeline way back. For those of you who may have read some of the history of science or philosophy of science, people acknowledge, right, that the Egyptians did some amazing engineering work, and they had some acknowledgement to some of the medicine. But really, when people talk about the scientific revolution, They're talking about something that's much more recent. They refer to, like, the 16th, 17th centuries, people like Francis Bacon, Galileo, Isaac Newton, etc. And those guys did like amazing things. But like all of us, they are building on the work of other people and are the beneficiaries of other people at the time. So Isaac Newton, I mean, if there's a case for somebody being called a genius, I think Isaac Newton, right? He just needed this extra tool, so he invented calculus, right? So that's the kind of person that he was. Very extraordinary. But a lot of the data that he was using was collected from the larger British Empire, from people that were indigenous subjects of the British Empire, people who were under slave conditions and what have you. So we really are the beneficiaries in all kinds of ways of the people around us. So I would say that those people, the farmers, the metal workers, etc., are empiricists, right? They're experimentalists who test their hypotheses. Hypothesis just means like an explanation for something, right? All right, so that's what we're talking about. And they predict outcomes based on data. I mean, by the standards of what we sometimes talk about as scientists today, some people in the past would not necessarily be called scientists. I mean, what we have is these unbelievable tools, advanced mathematics and now computers and what have you. But people who were scientists were basically people who were curious. They were just little kids that were curious and asking questions and just continued asking questions, and then learn some important skills to be able to refine that. But what we're able to do today is based on past knowledge and the tools that came and were developed before us, like microscopes, telescopes, mass spectrometers. These are the things that were developed that allow us to stretch and see new worlds. So if history teaches us anything, we know that our understanding of medicine today, or the cosmos, is limited. Because surely there will be other tools developed to be able to expand our ideas. So this may seem really far or distant from African American history, but let's just keep going for a second, if you don't mind. Okay? So let's keep going. So the people on this screen here, and you may not probably be able to read at the bottom, the little collage, I like collages, you can tell, the photos, the books and all that, are a number of people that really push back the timeline of the history of science all the way back to the ancient world. And we begin with somebody named Imhotep. Imhotep was known as the architect and engineer who built the pyramids in Egypt. There's Dozier, under Dozier. But he was also known as a physician. And the Ebers Papyrus, there's about 12 or so papyri, Egyptian medical script. And he's somebody who's considered like, one of the founding authors of what would become the Ebers Papyrus. In the same way that, the work of Galen, that name may be more familiar to you. Galen, the Roman physician, his work was standard for 1,000 years. Well, Imhotep's was probably standard for about 2,500 years, so a long time. Next to him is Peshiset. Now, Peshiset was considered the first female physician. As it turns out, there's no documentary evidence to say there was an individual. More the case that she was probably a composite figure, which is the case in many historical figures when you go to the distant past. And she was based in Sais, S-A-I-S, which is the Nile Delta. Interestingly, Sais was where the goddess Neith was worshipped, who would influence the Greeks, who they called Athena, who then the Romans called Minerva. So the Minerva statue, if you've been to the UNCG campus, I know 2 of us have been there. There's a beautiful, you have others, okay. For those of you who've been there, there's this beautiful statue. It's a very elegant statue by James Barnhill. It's about 17 feet up high, and it depicts Minerva. But like us, Minerva was a product of people and ideas before her, and so she's based on the Greek Athena goddess, who in part is based on Neith, the Egyptian. So Peshiset was at Sais, that's where Neith originates, and she was a foundational creator goddess. The next person there is somebody who's comes from Iraq, actually. It's not modern, the area of modern day Iraq. His name is Ibn al-Jahiz. And al-Jahiz was known for being somebody who was sort of at the borders, trying to figure out evolution, but not being able to put his finger on it. He said, something is up. Something is up. So people before Darwin were puzzled about certain things. And Darwin pulled it all together in an unbelievably masterful, data-rich way. But there were people that were at the edges. The idea of, or the development of chemistry is based on people who preceded them. You've heard of them. They're called alchemists, right? The word chemistry, very closely connected to that. If it wasn't for the tools that were developed by alchemists, chemistry probably wouldn't have been able to be developed in the way that it did. Lavoisier probably wouldn't have been able to do things because alchemists had tried things. And we poo-poo the people who had, like, as we see, silly ideas. I mean, before our understanding of combustion, we thought of this thing called phlogiston, that things were releasing this. Anyways, there are all kinds of fascinating sort of wrong ideas in the history of science. Like, who here, anybody get some bloodletting done? Bloodletting, leeches? No? No leeching? No leeching today? And they say they have, like, health services in the center? No leeching? Oh my gosh. Well, that was cutting-edge technology, right? If you went back a few hundred years ago, leeching was. Any, let's see, what about mercury? Any mercury pills? No? No mercury pills. Probably not a great idea. What about, what is it called? They used to bore holes into people's head. Trepanation, I think is what it's called. Anybody get their head bored out? You got a headache? They bore a hole in your head to release them. Anyways, things were tried. People were trying. Doctors were trying to figure out how to help people, right? And so people tried stuff. So in some ways, just because people went down the wrong path, we shouldn't throw them out as like being silly or, just superstitious or whatever. Let's have some respect for our elders, shall we? The next person over there is San Martin de Porres. And we're getting closer to African American history, right? San Martin de Porres was from Peru, and he was somebody who was of an African mother and a Spanish father, Spanish nobleman, and he became very religious and was apprenticed to a barber surgeon. Have you heard of barber surgeons before? Maybe some of you have. Well, that's how you became a surgeon. Like, that was one path of being a doctor. They were considered surgeons. And it's so funny for us today because we're like, wait, what? They cut your hair and they also do surgery on you? Yes, because they have sharp tools. I mean, that's basically what happened. So it's kind of funny, but that's what happened. So he actually was an apprentice, and he became very good at what he was doing. And people say, because ultimately he would become beatified and become a saint, they said that he was applying spiritual force as well. But he left the barber surgeon and went into a monastery and basically ran their infirmary and was beatified ultimately and made a saint because of the healings. We have Kwasi, who is somebody from Suriname, but originally from West Africa, who made some discoveries in terms of medicinal chemistry, or botany. An image here of somebody who, it's actually an image, a woodcut of Benjamin Banneker, an engineer in the early colonial America. But I wanted to kind of have an early image of somebody who would represent Onesimus, who we'll be talking about, who introduces virulation, so inoculation, into the colonies. The next person over there is an image of actually another Peruvian. I'm a little biased. In the early 19th century, Afro-Peruvians were permitted to go to medical school because if you were a Spaniard colonist, it's kind of messy being a doctor in those days. So probably easier just to be a government official or a lawyer or a religious, or go pursue a religious path and go up the ranks that way. Medicine was just a little dirty. And so Afro-Peruvians were permitted, and so there was a time in the early 19th century where you had at least like a quarter of the medical students were Afro-Peruvian, which is really kind of interesting. The next person, and now we get to African Americans, okay? So this is somebody who is considered a midwife from Georgia, and she was called Old Sibby. And Old Sibby was renowned as one of the teachers of other midwives. It was in the 19th century that midwives were really pushed aside by the medical profession was becoming increasingly professionalized, as is the case in many areas, like in music. If you talk to ethnomusicologists, they'll tell you about what happened with music. Music used to be something that everybody did. Everybody played music, everybody did it. But then there was a professionalization of a musician class, and that's true with a lot of different things in this country. And so midwives were pushed aside, but midwives who were African Americans were especially valuable to their communities, because they were more than just delivering, not just, I should say, more than delivering babies. They were attending to people's healthcare needs. There were also people there who were called root doctors. You may have heard of that term. It's in the South, you hear that. So people were health providers of different kinds. The next person I just want to point out is somebody who, Julian Everett Just, who was a biologist, who had some really interesting insights about cell developments. And so you have, probably it's the case of 99% of you, or most of you hadn't heard of Sibi or him, but maybe some of you have heard of Kismenia Corbett. Has anybody heard of her by any chance? No? Well, we should all be pretty grateful, because she was the one who headed up the lab where the mRNA vaccine was developed. So thank you, Dr. Corbett, right? So lesser known history, that there were multiple labs that were working on this, but she was one of the key leaders in that. So I think that we have to understand that there is a line, a connection between, Dr. Corbett going all the way back to Imhotep, in that people are building on each other's knowledge. Right? When you're in an academic discipline, one of the things that you do when you write your master's thesis or your dissertation is you do what's called a lit review, which is short for a literature review. You want to see what is it that other people have said about this topic, and then you build on it. So in the same way, African Americans are part of a much larger history, world history, and the history of science. Oops, I keep pushing this thing back here. Let me stop here, because I see a couple of you nodding off. Now I know it's kind of, maybe you had lunch and you're a little sleepy, but I do want to check in. I think it's important for me not to yap on without checking. What do you think about what I'm saying so far? You're nice, right? But maybe some of you are like, this is outrageous, right? This is just wrong. But I don't know. In some ways, the spirit of my scholarship is always to kind of just play with stuff, try stuff, and see, And again, I've been teaching actually with a professor of biochemistry for the last 6-7 years, and we've been exploring this in really what's a classes on the history and the philosophy of science. But I've been sharing this more with audiences, because it does rub some people the wrong way to consider farmers scientists. Because there's a hierarchy that's been established. There's a kind of way in which we've internalized that hierarchy. My wife happens to be a physician, and I know she has certain biases. I mean, and I love my wife, and she's a lovely person, but that's just part of the training. It's hard to let go of a certain kind of.
This is where we're headed, is making connections.
Oh, well, thank you. Oh, that's very kind. She said, this is where we're heading, about making connections, and that's what I'm trying to do. Thank you for saying that. I appreciate it. What is your name? Joe. Okay, I'm going to quote you. I'm going to say, Joe said. All right? If anybody messes with Omar, Joe is on it. Okay.
Breaking down some boundaries.
That's right, breaking down some boundaries. Okay. So, one of the figures, can you see, am I blocking your view? You're okay? Okay. One of the figures in Central Africa. Now, Africa, when people talk about Africa, most of us are pretty ignorant about Africa, because we're not taught really about African geography, African history. Most of us know about the transatlantic slave trade, right? That's kind of the thing that we know. We know, there were kingdoms there. There's Safari, there's the Egyptians were there, but we really don't appreciate it. It's always interesting to me in history departments, and I've been in 3 or 4 different history departments over my career, and you have you have 6 Americanists, and you have 8 Europeanists, and then you have 1 Latin Americanist, and 1 Africanist, and 1 Asianist, right? It's not quite always that small. I've been part of smaller history departments, but oftentimes we just we just don't have the deep knowledge. It's not taught in schools and what have you. It's not like this, I don't know, it's not like there's a room full of like people, smoking cigars, like saying, we're not gonna teach them. It's just, it's a function of our society. This has come about. So Africa is tremendously diverse, and the point of all this is that there are many ways in which people are referred to as healers or doctors. There's over 50 countries in Africa today, but actually, let me ask you, how many languages do you think are spoken in Africa? You're like, oh, is that like 7 languages? No. Hundreds? Oh, this is a very well-read crowd. Yes. There are somewhere between 1,200 and 1,500 distinct languages, right? So we're all speaking a certain language, English, right? Do we have other languages here? Speak other languages? Do you speak another language? No. Pig Latin? No. Okay. I never got Pig Latin. Everybody, kids around me were like, dude, Pig, I couldn't, my brain didn't work, yeah. Other languages you speak here? Spanish? Anybody in Spanish? Poquito? Yeah. French? Okay, yeah. German? You speak German too? You did? Oh, okay. All right. So, yeah, 4 languages. Most people would say Spanish is different from German, right? Spanish is closer to Italian and Portuguese, but distinct. So we're talking about distinct African language, not dialects, people, not dialects, because oftentimes that's kind of talked about, oh yeah, they have a lot of, no, distinct languages, okay? So tremendous diversity. In Ethiopia alone, there's something like 80 different languages. It's sort of mind-blowing. So there are many names for people who are called healers. And in Africa, in Central Africa, among the Kibunda people, it's called Nganga. So what these practitioners do, and oftentimes they're called, what do you think the colonists called them, these healers? It's not the nicest word. What do you think? Witch doctors. Okay, that's what, somebody's buzzing. Who are you? And okay, somebody, I'm going to put this away because I don't need to respond to that. Yeah, witch doctors is usually the term that's used. Does that sound like positive, negative, neutral? It's pretty negative, right? It kind of has a connotation of sort of like something that's a little bit, I don't even know, dangerous, mysterious, but not in a good way.
Based on superstition.
Superstitious, yeah, that's the word I was looking for. Thank you for that. What were you going to say, Joe? Primitive. Oh, yes, that's absolutely primitive is the word that's oftentimes used. My wife says she's a dermatologist, and what she says is that she often has to do like what shamans do, right? She says oftentimes it's nothing but what I say, but saying it with a certain confidence, saying you're going to be okay. Just putting her hand on somebody and doing that. And I thought about that comment because I think that there is a power in an authority saying something with that authority. And so I've thought about this in terms of spells, right? So when we think of spells like, I don't know, like Harry Potter spells, right? Like magical spells. How different, it's a question, how different is it from when, did anybody like fall and scrape their knee when they were a kid? Raise your hand if you have. Okay, we all have, right? Or when you're an adult. Right? But when you're a kid and say your mom or your dad were around, what did they do when you scraped your knee?
Give you a kiss.
They gave you a little kiss, right? They give you a little kiss, and they say something. What do they usually say?
It'll be all right.
Oh, you can be okay, right? Oh, here's a little kiss, right? How different is that, you're going to be okay, than an incantation or a spell, right? There's a power in the words that people who we trust, that we feel know stuff, can do. So I'm trying to push us to not think of this magical spiritual stuff as so distant from our ordinary practices, whether it's your dermatologist or it's your mom or whoever it is in your life who's done that to you, and you feel like, oh. I think we've all had that experience when you've gone to like a doctor and they've told you it's going to be okay, and you're like, whew, right? And also the opposite, right? The words carry a lot, the power. So these Ngangas, healers or doctors in Kikongo and Lingala, which are languages in Central Africa, use metaphysical, spiritual, magical, right, methods in treating disease. But the treatment has a psychological basis, and what I would say is the power of persuasion, of assurance, right? It's going to be okay, right? And the placebo effect. The placebo effect is really, really powerful, right? I mean, there's so much that our minds can do. You know, as my friend Rusty says, you know, mind over matter. If you don't mind, don't matter, right? So there's a power in just kind of assurance, like self-assurance, like, yeah, it's all gonna be okay, yeah. So supplemented, of course, by, there's this catch-all term of herbal medicines. It's like all kinds of things, and it's hard to pinpoint when you look at the documents, because as a historian, I'll look at research and the document sources, right? Some of it comes out in some of the oral history, it's more recent, but it's hard to get, okay, what plant are you talking about? Exactly, what are you talking about? How much? Or other natural products, medicines, and physical treatment, right? So African Americans are part of this much larger history in the world, in the history of science. This is just an image of that Ebers papyrus. Do you remember the name of the guy I mentioned? This is a test, a quiz. You're having a quiz, by the way. What is the, remember the name of the person I mentioned? Imhotep. Remember I said Imhotep. Imhotep. So Imhotep was like, have you heard of Galen, the physician, the Roman physician? Maybe some of you have it. So he was really important for a long. Imhotep was like that. Super. It's kind of like, it's like thinking of our world without the foundational work of Aristotle. Like Aristotle was like, he did a lot of writing and it was preserved. Okay. So again, if we think about science more broadly as the systematic effort of observing, asking questions, offering explanations, hypothesis, experimenting, replicating, and then ultimately predicting, I think that the people or the person who figured out how to control fire was a scientist. I mean, well, many of you are probably of generations who you were Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts. Who are Scouts in here? Scouts? Scouts? All right. So you all probably know how to make a fire. Maybe it's been a minute since you've actually made a fire. But most of us, if you were with me, if I was leading us in those days, we would all die because I wouldn't know how to make a fire. I mean, I've seen videos where, you know, what have you. But so somebody figured out how to control fire. This is a huge, huge discovery, right? Because what it does is it allows us to cook and to be able to take in more nutrients and be more efficient in that way. Ultimately, our brain expands, our prefrontal cortex, which allows us to imagine more in addition to other things. It allows us to migrate. Fire was developed around 1 million years ago, más o menos, right? These are not Homo sapiens sapiens, these are our ancestors. These are Homo erectus, my favorite hominids, by the way. They were like so cool. We should all have Homo erectus, thank you. Because they're the ones who figured out fire, thank you, Homo erectus ancestors, right? They're our foreparents, right? We're all cousins, by the way. You all realize that, right? You and I, Joe, we're cousins. We're all cousins. So we all go back. We've got a group of about 70 or 80 of us, somewhere around 70,000 years ago, who migrated out of Africa successfully and we're all the descendants of those people, according to the geneticists. So the Homo erectus essentially took over or went across much of the world. But we developed other tools, right? So stone tools, which I think in popular imagination is so rudimentary, is so primitive, right? To use Joe's word. But actually, has anybody ever tried to make a stone tool? Have you seen people do it? It's really cool. Actually, if you go to the Greensboro History Museum, in one of the exhibits, there's some video documentary showing somebody trying to, making stone tools, like modern people who are showing that it's this real art and science. And so stone tools allowed us to, again, advance in all kinds of ways, create clothes for ultimately to cut things, to cut down the animals that we kill off. And so the history of science that we are the beneficiaries of, that includes, Kizmenia Corbett's work, and mRNA vaccination, is part of a much larger history, And a lot of it goes back to Africa, because that's where we've been mostly, right, as a species. And so, whether it's the Neolithic Revolution with the advent of agriculture and domestication of animals, metalworking, and other kinds of technologies that allowed us to spread out, we are the beneficiaries of all these people. Let me stop right here for a second. So, I said earlier on that I think that we have to pay homage, we have to do a shout out, whatever you want to call it, to people who try to figure out how we've come about. There's no better example of efforts to explain the natural world than creation stories, right? So how did this all start? So what's the dominant creation story that we have today? Like most people, like how did we come about? What's that? Genesis, right? Yeah. The big, okay, and also there's people who say, but the Big Bang. Okay, so there's different kinds of creation stories. Now, again, I think astrophysicists would take offense if the Big Bang was talked about as a creation story. But I think that it's fair to say that it's part of a larger way of understanding the creation of the cosmos. And so, just as there's been many explanations or many developments in the history of science that go back to Africa and then ultimately take us all the way up to African American history, there are many different creation stories. And I think it's just pointed out that Genesis is one of them. The Chinese, Chinese are made up of many people, have their own stories that have to do with these turtles stacked on top of each other. And of course, in Africa, there are many different kinds of creation stories. And so this is one of the Yoruba people. In the beginning, water was everywhere. Turns out there was a Greek philosopher who actually asked that kind of question or came to that conclusion. His name was Thales. Does that name ring a bell to anybody? Pre-Socratic, so before Socrates. So before, it's kind of like Jesus. Everything before Jesus is considered before Christ, and then afterwards is after Christ, or BCE. Now we say before Common Era, and before Common Era, and then Common Era. There was about 20 years ago, scholars started to replace AD and BC because it seemed too Jesus-centered. But it's the BCE and CE still hold to actually the birth of Christ as a foundational thing, and it is pretty foundational. But basically, you have these creation stories, and one of the stories that in the Greek tradition was of everything being made of water. And so Thales was somebody who was asking that question and came to that conclusion. But other people have come to those kind of conclusions and added layers of understanding to that. Before the advent of germ theory and what we understand as medicine, there was the idea of humors, different things. Like we had these 4 different humors, black bile and yellow bile and blood, etc. So things have changed and we have different explanations. And to your point, of course, the Big Bang is the scientific understanding of the origins of the universe that go back 13.7 or 13.8 billion years ago, with the evidence being radio waves that have been traveling since that time, which were detected in the 1960s. So many different kinds of explanations, and I think it's fair to say that we try to understand the unknown by analogy to things that which we are familiar with. So Egyptians did that. They had these 8 gods, they called it Ogwad, who were basically representing different elements. Is that so completely different from our periodic table? I don't know. I trust my chemistry colleagues and my physicist colleagues to tell me that there are these things called atoms, and that you have protons and neutrons, and there's electron clouds surrounding them, and those protons can be divided into subatomic particles. I don't know. I haven't seen them, right? So I trust the scientists, because I think, I kind of think that, I figure they know better than me in terms of some of those things, right? People had their own explanations, right? So the theme again here is people are trying things, they're testing stuff out, they're trying to push the boundaries, they're offering explanations, and African Americans are part of that very rich tradition. So let me take it to couple of people here so we can end, and then we can open up. So this was the person, Kismekia Corbett, an immunologist, actually from North Carolina, by the way, who was one of the key people in the development of the COVID-19 vaccine. So let me end here, and let's open things up for any questions, conversation that you might like to have, okay? All right, here we go. You can clap now. Let's clap. All right. Okay. What do you think? Tell me your thoughts. Okay, you're gonna have to get in line because there's so many questions. I'm not sure who to go to first. What's that?
Give us a chance to think.
Oh yeah, think about it. Yeah, go for it.
One thing I thought I was kind of maybe irrelevant to what we've been talking about. You're talking about farmers being scientists and all. I worked in the industry, was an engineer in a manufacturing, it happened to be a printing company, but
Yeah.
I was in other manufacturing things too. And I learned real quick, if you really wanted to know what's going out, you go out and talk to the guy on the machine.
That's right.
Now, in the office, you're talking about, we got this problem, we got that problem. Supervisor says this, the manager says that. But if you really want to know what's happening, you go out there and talk to the guy that's standing out there every day, seeing the product up there,
That's
right in
right.
front of him. He knows every problem, he's seen everything.
That's
there's
right.
how often it happens. And
Yeah.
I learned real quick, that's where you go.
That's where you need to go to get the actual.
answer,
Yeah. And it's trial and error, right?
Yeah.
And they would never characterize the work of that person as, systematic observation, hypothesizing that. But we've added this formality to things that people are doing and trying out. And it's true. My wife was. She told me that out of medical school. This was in South American Colombia. She was sent to a smaller town, and it was her and a nurse and a room, and that was it. And so she was delivering babies when she was in medical school. In South America, you go to medical school right after high school. You go straight to medical school. You don't do those 4 years. So you graduate much earlier. So you're a practicing physician earlier. So she was delivering babies when she was 22 years old, and she was saying to me that how terrified she was. How do I have to deliver a baby? It's just me. I've never done this before. The nurse is like, it's okay. I got this, right? Because she had X number of years, and she was the one who guided her, my wife, who'd gone to fancy medical school, right? To your point, and how to do this. So, absolutely. Yeah. Yes.
What kinds of pushback do you get from people when you present these ideas?
Well, it's interesting that you say this because mostly I've been speaking to students and graduate students, and because of sort of the role that I have, people don't usually push back so much. And so I haven't spoken in more places where people would feel okay to push back. I think that a lot of people have reactions in their heads about this, but a lot of people are like, oh, that's really, I never thought about it like that either. So it's kind of, I suspect that there's a lot more pushback, but it's just not being articulated, or maybe that's not pushback then, but I think that there's some disagreements there. But mostly people are like, that's kind of an interesting way of putting it. I want to keep going, and I'm going to do this with my colleague, the biochemist. Her name is Dr. Nadja Czech, and to do it in front of the chemistry, the American Chemical Association, and places like that, because I think there we're going to get some serious pushback. Because she's an outlier as a scientist. Most scientists enjoy their position of privilege. In our society, scientists enjoy a certain privilege of being knowers. I was always struck, and part of the reason why I ended up getting a PhD is because I'm like, you know what, when you get a PhD, people think you know all kinds of stuff. And so in some ways, it's like, no, you actually are trained to learn this very particular area. But I think the same thing with physicians. I think that, and other research scientists, there's a kind of way in which you become a knower of things beyond your actual areas of study. And I think that there's a kind of socialization that you're better than. And I think most would not acknowledge that, and I think that there is a culture of that. And so people like to be the holders of special knowledge. And I was remembering, I don't know if you remember, there was a colleague, he retired, Frank Woods. He was an art historian. Frank Woods once said to me, we were both teaching in our Black Studies program, and he said to me once, he says, oh yeah, as a historian, da-da-da-da-da. And this is 15 years ago, so a little bit younger and not as wise. And I remember in my brain saying, no, you're not. You're an art historian. You're not a historian. You know, historians know how to properly footnote and cite things. Art historians don't. Like, I remember having this silly reaction in my head. And I hold on to that because I'm like, oh yeah, we're indoctrinated in the training to think that our way is the better way and we're better than. So I think that there's going to be more pushback in speaking to audiences that are more socialized to think of themselves as better than. But I don't know. What do you think?
Oh, well, it makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah.
But, I'm just wondering about, you talked about many historians stay within, like I do European history,
Yeah.
I do
Yes.
French history,
Right.
whatever,
Exactly.
whatever. How do your colleagues in history commission do that?
Yeah, it's interesting. And so even within a certain discipline, and I know this from the chemistry department, like there's a hierarchy between the organic chemists or the organic chemists are higher than the analytical chemists, for instance, right? There's a hierarchy. The physical chemists think that they're the cat's meow, kind of like, there's like, in history there is also some of that. And so intellectual history or other things are seen as like, better than. And I would say that the American and European historians tend to see themselves in a certain light. But I think that it depends on the personality. The biggest distinction is basically people who are on board with the idea of world history as something that you can study and really appreciating comparative histories versus those who say, no, that's too superficial. You need to really go deep in one area. I mean, I could have spent the rest of my life working on the particular area of my dissertation, but I was like, that's so boring. Like, there's so much to learn, so I think that there's, depending on who you're talking to, I'm well received or, sort of given a little smile, and that's basically it.
Why is there so much negative, violent pushback to new ideas within the scientific community?
Why is there so much, I'm going to repeat it so people get it, why is there so much negative, violent responses to new ideas in the sciences? Yeah.
Gestalt is presented,
Yeah.
and there's just
Pushback, yeah.
and no consideration of it.
Yeah, I mean,
Want to burn them at the stake.
right, that's right, and people were. I mean, Giordano Bruno was burnt at the stake for advocating for Copernicus's ideas in 1600. He was one of my great heroes. And there's a kind of thing, I think it's people just invested in their way of looking at things, and oftentimes entire careers are based on a particular argument. I had an undergraduate student, Kendall Walker, who was working in a lab, in the statistics lab, and she was raising something about the faculty member's work, which got a huge pushback, and she was really taken by it because she was basically challenging, and she was kind of pulling out something that was going to undermine his whole understanding of this particular field of statistical modeling.
Is that because of super specialization?
Yeah.
Down into this.
Is that because of super specialization, Joe's asking? I think there's part of that. I always felt like, like if you're going to be called a doctor of something, you should at least know enough about I should know enough European history or Latin American history or something like that to be able to be conversant. But I think people almost take pride in being like super specialist. Like, oh, I don't do Latin American history. Oh, I don't do Africa. I don't do European history. And I think that happens in different fields. And I think that myopia, that over-specialization, leaves us vulnerable. I think that we should be able to communicate with different people. During the pandemic, by the way, I actually went back to school. I went back and I took some classes in biology and chemistry at Guilford College because I love Guilford. I didn't do it at UNCG because I also recruit faculty to teach in honors. It was just been awkward. And so I went to Guilford and I loved going back and doing biology and chemistry as an adult. It was so cool. Like, it's very different going to school when you're an adult, right? As you know, when you're going to these classes. But when you take classes for real, it's like very different than when you were like younger. You appreciate the professors so much more. You're like, oh, thank you. So yeah, I think there's pushback. I think people are emotionally invested and also professionally invested, right? And it's hard to admit that you might be wrong. I don't know, I do. I find it hard to be told I might be wrong about something. But I think that's the spirit of science, is that something is only valid until new data that disproves it, and there's a new way of understanding that's better. I mean, one of the interesting things is that in some ways, this idea of Occam's razor, that the most concise explanation is the best explanation, isn't necessarily true all the time. Things are a little bit more complex, but it's true that you can have multiple models of the same thing that explain it perfectly well. I mean, we all did just perfectly fine with Newtonian physics. I mean, large buildings were built, bridges, all kinds of things were done. That's the physics that my father learned as an engineer, as a civil and structural engineer. But like, how much more does quantum mechanics and quantum physics actually do to kind of expand our understanding of the world? So, in some ways, some things are very practical. Yes.
It kind of reminds me of I think I'm a historian myself. I like to read all the time. I was an engineer by reading.
Yeah.
And I remember Omar Bradley, General Bradley, had a comment. And he said, the second best course of action, quickly determined and immediately and vigorously implemented, will always be the best course of action, belatedly determined and half-heartedly implemented.
Oh, that's so interesting. That's great. That's a very, I can imagine him saying that. My father was a big fan of this. Other questions or thoughts that come to you? I'm curious. I'm genuinely curious about like what you think, even if you think it's misguided or wrong, and how so. If you want to play devil's advocate, I'm game. Yeah. Well, listen, it's really nice to meet you. What I was trying to do is just basically locate certain African American figures, and I'll just mention the virologist because I did raise his name and then I didn't talk about him. But his name was Onesimus, and this comes from a document that shows part of who he was. This was an image of him. It's somebody who is sort of just, because I find it helpful to have an image of somebody who lives around that time period, so you can kind of connect with it better. But he's the person who introduced to Cotton Mather in Boston, when there was an outbreak of smallpox, this practice which was known in West Africa for many generations of virulation, which is basically introducing part of a dead, so basically taking some of the pus of a sore or in powdered form, and then ingesting it to trigger your immune system. So it's not vaccination, it's virulation, but it's a kind of inoculation, which was very effective. And he's credited with helping the Boston community, contain smallpox in this outbreak.
The Maasai still do that.
The who did?
The Maasai.
The Maasai still do that? Yeah, oh, there we go. Okay, thank you, Joe. Yeah. So basically, this is a practice that was introduced, and we have a number of African American figures that are part of this tradition. So, I hope this has been of some interest to you. It's really nice to meet you on this snowy day. Oh, it looks like it stopped snowing. Did it stop? It's slowed down, and I will be on my way now. But thank you very much for having me.